Helping organizations thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Dr. Elia Bojulova. Welcome to you, Elia.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to have you on the show. You are a former Special Forces psychologist and you're now a performance coach. And today we're going to be exploring the capacity of curiosity to broaden our learnings and view on resilience. And I really want to understand your perspective on resilience as well. But before we get into that, Elia, I'd like to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
There is a mentor of mine, Julian, who I used to serve with, and he used to say, "You've nailed life if you found your thing." And my thing is service. I don't think I have felt like I am working for 24 years because virtually everything I do aligns with my values, with my sense of purpose. I don't have a day where I have not been astonished by human potential and just how much better we can be. I'm either outrageously lucky, which is probably true, or it so happens to be that humans are extraordinary, particularly when they are in conditions where they see themselves being able to stand at their best, or at least recognize the potential and commit to it. Um, so the short of it is, I absolutely love what I do. It astonishes and surprises me. It's a field I cannot stop geeking out on. I don't think there's been a year in the last 20 where I haven't formally studied. And yet, the minute I cover one chapter, I'm just thinking, there's so much more. So it's extraordinary, right?
And it's great to have that perspective that life is a constant learning process, isn't it? I think if we feel we've arrived, we've not arrived at all. We're continually growing and developing, and I love that of when I unfold into each new year. I'm excited for the new year, but also not just for what it might bring, but also for what I might understand about myself, because I'm always learning more about myself as we go. And were you
Mhm.
intentional about that whole purpose? Because obviously purpose thing is quite a thing today, isn't it? People want to find that purpose, get clarity. And I do a lot of stuff for my clients. Were you intentional about 24 years ago about getting into what you're doing, what you love now?
I don't know about being intentional 24 years ago, but I remember growing up with distinct feeling. I grew up in Bulgaria in quite a turbulent time, and my dad is someone who was very helpful in challenging perspectives. And so I distinctly recall moments in time where the contrast between living life of just reacting and being a slave of events as opposed to being intentional, purposeful, and finding something worth engaging with in everything you've got, in every day you've got. I distinctly remember the feeling that this makes, the difference that it makes as a feeling. So it's perhaps that kind of gift from my dad, as opposed to I would be shocked if I didn't think of that 24 years ago when I committed to my studies. It petrifies me. The idea of living without sense of purpose frightens me a little. You know.
Yeah, no, I get that. I understand that. And it's something I've probably lived through it 20, 30 years ago, but probably realized in the last 6, 7 years that I was what my purpose was, I guess. It just took me a little bit longer to unearth it, I guess. So yeah, that's for me. So we're talking resilience today, and I'd like to get just almost what sparked your interest in resilience and studying it, understanding it, sort of through that sort of psychological lens.
I think it's again growing up. My dad, in particular, plus a number of family members, were very involved in pursuing the unknown, doing challenging things. They were climbers, hang gliders, hang glider pilots, mountaineers, Air Force pilots. And the idea of pushing past your limits physically, mentally, discovering just how much more you can be was kind of part of the mixture. And with that, the kind of question of what allows some of us to thrive? Why are some of us seeking this? Are these people made of different stuff? And what is it that leads some people to fall by the wayside at what appears to be kind of a mundane challenge? Where is that point of difference? Are these things transferable? So I think it's a lifelong um, excitement that I have with resilience and what it actually means for us to, bounce forward better than our predicament found us.
And how has your, because I know you've got a military background, how has
Mhm.
your military background and what you've observed there, whether that's your own experience or what you've observed in others, influence your perspective on resilience and how you, in terms of that, in how you operate now?
The interesting part is this may be unique to the New Zealand Defence Force, particularly the New Zealand Special Forces. But one would assume when we are thinking about resilience in military context, you're thinking about like, some, gritty, unbreakable things, things being humans that assume kind of a different version of themselves. And I learned quickly the opposite is true. Grittiness, yes, essential, but agility, adaptability, capacity for curiosity is the key predictor to resilience. And that astonished me. It wasn't necessarily an explicit thing, but actually getting to see how tough humans who have the capacity to overcome extraordinarily complex things and still be generous and kind and considerate with those that they interact with, the stuff that this is made of surprised me. Again, because we all have that assumption that military means tough and nothing else. So yeah, that was the gift of that experience.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that perspective that military people are all just tough, resilient, and it's all about grit, determination, and just pushing through on things. And that's such a, I thought it was a real, not a very simplistic binary view of resilience. I think, as you say, curiosity is quite important, and understanding things. And just thinking about curiosity, can you give I suppose, an example that curiosity for you enabled you to overcome a challenge or a situation that you were in? Not I want to lead you, but I'll throw in the word Syria might be a thing that might help you jog your mind of, because I know that that's an experience for you that could sort of be helpful for others people to sort of understand from your perspective how you dealt with that.
Yeah. I mean, I laughed when you said Syria because, to be honest, I tried to find more intricate examples of that, of which there are many. But this is perhaps the most confronting exposure, and also the situation that I was involved in Syria was the reason why I formally commenced my studies and work in the connection between resilience and curiosity. It was kind of a retrospective realization that this is what saved us. And when I say this is what saved us, between 2012 and 2013, I served in Syria as a UN military observer. And we had a number of really confronting encounters. This was the time, the intensity of the environment was very high. But in May 2013, myself and two of my colleagues were taken hostage in Syria. And the short of it is our return wasn't probable. There were all sorts of negative outcomes that people back home, being in our base, as well as here in New Zealand and every one of the nations that my colleagues belong to, they anticipated some really bad outcomes for us. And yet we managed to talk our way out of our predicament and talked our way out of us being held hostage. And in retrospect, as we were unpacking it, we realized that what did save us and what allowed us to open these channels for conversation, for discussion, for debate and exploration of alternatives was our capacity to maintain curiosity about the mindset of our captors, their intentions, and our standing in the moment. And so when you have this, I mean, particularly as a, I fancy myself a scientist, right? Like, particularly as a geek in the field of psychology, to be in a physical environment that in such a saturated way shows you what the body feels and what the mind can think, given the opportunity to explore. That's really what kind of solidified my commitment to it.
And what was going on at that time? I don't know, almost like, how long were you in hostage for? But also, how did you deal with all the emotions that came with that? Because I mean, it must have been a horrific experience. Never experienced it in my life, and I hope never to. But I can't imagine that situation. So, how did you deal with the emotional side? Because that must have been really quite stressful and sort of difficult at the time.
One of the success stories of our ordeal, or the kind of the success components, is that we never transitioned deeper into Syria. We were held relatively close to the Golan Heights. And in that way, there was higher probability of us succeeding negotiation. If we were handed over to alternative groups, it would have been different for us. And we probably would have been lost for a much longer period of time. But the intensity of that period was quite significant, because the period of time that we had was packed, relatively short, and you had to really carefully look for the openings and discover ways in which you can influence your predicament. But how you deal with the emotions, I distinctly remember noticing surges of fear, of even moments of kind of despair, and obviously noticing discomfort and what discomfort can create in terms of our ability to predict outcomes for ourselves, and how if we set our minds on a negative outcome, our behavior seems to confirm it, so the emotions were every kind of spectrum of the color scheme, and oftentimes, particularly when we were sleep deprived and in situations where we didn't seem to have much reason to grasp hope, they would change relatively quickly. The job to be done is to focus on the one that serves you best. And I think we did that as a group. And this is the thing, right? I don't know if we would have done, either of us would have done as well if we were held in isolation. I genuinely believe that the fact that we knew we were there, we weren't necessarily allowed or encouraged to speak to each other, but we knew we were there sharing this experience. And the mere presence of a trusted party in a complex predicament like that boosted our efficacy, even if it is on behalf of someone else, right? Because you can't, for the lack of a better phrase, you can't drop lip or give up or, act in a way that suggests you're overwhelmed by the event, because that'll influence your mate's experience of it. So we were in this kind of unconscious pack between each other, trying to support one another, finding tiny moments for humor, silver linings, and guiding each other to hope in a way in which we engaged.
And how did you keep those narratives positive? Because as you say, you're in a situation like that, and your immediate situation is, oh, it's all going to end in I'm going to die. How do you keep that hope going? But also, was there moments? There was three of you, wasn't there? That you obviously supported each other, and there was moments when some of you were lower than others, and you kept putting each other up, I guess, through that sort of situation.
Yeah. There's some really practical examples of that, and some of them are odd, but it's amazing what a quick glance at someone can do, a quick smile. I always hear about the actions of one of my colleagues who, and I'll give you an example, right? When we were taken out of our observation post, we were dragged through minefields that were surrounding our observation post, and these were positioned there supposedly for our protection. And earlier on that day, myself and my colleague had been training on this concrete platform. It was a really quiet operational day. We were training, we were listening to a song by The Prodigy. There's a line in there that goes, "We walk through the minefields." Many hours later, we three of us find ourselves in this predicament. And the absurdity of this is this. I'll come back to your other question, but I will never forget the ridiculousness of the human reaction. My experience was, remember clenching my teeth so hard, my jaw was hurting, and it was in preparation for an explosion. And I remember randomly thinking to myself, am I trying to protect my dentures in the event that I walk into a minefield? Like, is this vanity gone wrong? But it's just a silly thing, right? Like small little reactions like that. And then as we were going through this, my colleague turned to me and said, "Dude, we are doing it for real." Like, you don't think you're gonna find a moment of humor like that. Trying to bring back a memory of several hours later when we were free to play Prodigy on our boombox and do press ups, just to kill time. And suddenly you get this tiny little moment. He paid consequences for this, but you get this tiny little moment of injection of energy. I've repeated this component so many times, and it still stays with me as one of the most remarkable examples of awareness, of belonging, of commitment to a fellow human. Just, I'm sure he had gazillions of fears competing for his attention in this moment. But in that moment in time, he thought, let me draw a link that boosts our confidence and self-esteem. It's just, who does that? And then you kind of, once you hook into this trajectory of thought, I don't think when there were so many things changing, it was a very dynamic situation the whole way through. Anything could lead to a different outcome, right? And so it's quite literally you're in this kind of minefield of negotiation for the longest of time, and you don't know what will trigger what reaction for a little while, right? So I don't think staying in the positive was a conscious decision. But I do know that it was a survival mechanism, because in some of these circumstances, and that's again heroing up the accessibility of resilience. In our situation, if we had defaulted to the dark line of thought, and allowed ourselves to slip down the line, you almost physically feel the impact of that. You feel the grasp of fear on you when you let yourself walk that line, and you don't want to go there because it's uncomfortable enough as it is. You know what I mean? So it's just that, oh, let me give it another minute. I'm just going to give it and it's micro boosts of hope and optimism that eventually become the hope line. And then the longer you ride it, the more familiar it becomes. So I genuinely feel it was a basic survival mechanism that we traversed that as opposed to the alternative.
Fantastic. And I think humor can do an awful lot, can't it, to
Absolutely.
lift our spirits and just shake us out of that sort of negative vibe or despairing vibe that you may have had at moments, particularly being dragged through a minefield, literally. Which, yeah, let's explore a bit more about that curiosity, why curiosity really helps with resilience, and you having this almost asking questions about, you're curious about your people who are holding you hostage, what were their intentions, what was
Yeah.
that whole piece on curiosity. Why does that help? And almost, thinking about leaders who are listening to this show right now, how they can use curiosity in situations, perhaps not in a hostage situation, but they may feel quite trapped or in a difficult challenge in their business, in their organization, and how curiosity could really help them navigate and work them through that sort of situation.
Curiosity has to be one of the most important vehicles I see for successful leaders, and for any to be honest, teams and organizations as well. Capacity to nurture it and to sustain it is essential. And I think it applies across every aspect. All of us have experienced the flow consequences of COVID and the reactions that this can bring about, or the limiting things that can happen to our cognition, our decision-making ability, our problem-solving abilities, our abilities to engage with other people. So first kind of part of this question that you posed, I want to address what it actually does, and then let's talk about how we get there. So what it does is that it allows us to move away from fight, flight, freeze response, which we have all experienced, and start expanding our ability to process different inputs of information a little bit more richly. The more we do that, the greater our scope for influence over our situation becomes, the greater our capacity to intentionally, as opposed to reactively, engage with our situation. And I think most importantly, I think the capacity to be surprised, to explore what you think is fixed from a different angle in order for you to enrich your ability to engage with it is essential. The trick with it, of course, is that you can't be already in a fight, flight, freeze mode and as easily tap into a state of curiosity, right? So it's a conditioned muscle, I think. And many of us struggle with it a great deal more than we should, because we quite like our opinions of threat. Most of us, particularly when we are rushed, busy, sleep deprived, depleted, end of year, all that stuff, are very comfortable with the worst case scenario, kind of folding our arms into a pretzel and assuming a defensive stance, and that is not a curiosity mindset. And so I think it is essential, because you simply cannot effectively engage with a fellow human or with a meaningful proposition in the absence of it. In the absence of it, all we are doing is quick fix solution, short-term rationality. And I get to see, pragmatically speaking, I get to see so many contexts in business and the venture world where we run the risk of significant mistakes emerging due to reactionary behavior as opposed to curious states of mind. It's sinful, that we waste this amazing gift we've got. Hopefully that made sense, Julian. I'm wildly passionate about this.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, that being curious, because I know and I've taught this with the clients, when you get into a situation you are in fight or flight, which is sometimes hard to get out of, just asking some questions about that scenario, like, what's the wisdom in this feeling? It suddenly shifts you from your amygdala going crazy into more of a prefrontal cortex. And I think that's it's trying to shift that more questioning and almost third person stuff, which then pulls you out yourself, doesn't it, a little bit in that situation?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Like if you ask yourself the questions as simple as I wonder whether, I wonder how, I wonder why, and you do it genuinely, right? Sometimes you see kind of supposedly curious questions being posed, and they are just a mirror image of the fight, flight, freeze response we are masking, right? So it has to be a genuine state of wanting to understand something from a different angle. And so when that happens, you temporarily disrupt that tango dance with the amygdala that you mentioned, right? And so we do need the beautiful, rich parts of our brain that are responsible for balanced reasoning and exploration of ideas and interpersonal engagement. And so, yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated. It is, what is the saying? It is challenging. It is difficult, but it doesn't have to be complicated.
And how do we create, I suppose, from a leadership point of view, obviously being curious is genuinely being interested, isn't it? It's that sort of,
Mhm.
in a situation, in a challenge that you may be faced, and I think that curiosity creates those different perspectives. How do we create, I suppose, teams that become curious? Because the more curious a team is, in essence, will become more ability to overcome challenges, therefore become more resilient.
Now, because you went to the question of teams, I quickly want to say I don't think we create curious teams, and we don't create curious people. I think people and teams made of people are innately curious unless we constrain curiosity. I get to see the negative side of that continuum constantly, right? So the first rule of leadership is if you are leading, anything more than yourself, get out of its way so that you can actually tap into its own curiosity. But like again, we don't need to go crazy on kind of the mechanics of the mind, but curiosity follows its own trajectory. So your and my pathway of asking questions doesn't have to be the same, because we still have to hook it onto existing experiences. And the reason why this is very important is the starting point of curiosity is, of course, awareness, being aware of your own biases and your own state of being and your own kind of capacity to access as much of your curiosity as you'd like. We don't always have the same access to it. And sometimes it's important to kind of leave it for another day, leave it for another moment when you are better prepared to observe this thing from a different perspective, especially when we are talking about wicked or complicated challenges. But, maintaining awareness and allowing conversations, ideas, views, kind of resistance to ideas and views to be communicated in a constructive, free flowing way is the way in which we get out of the way of curiosity. So I guess as rushed, busy, determined leaders, oftentimes we let bias for action get in the way of curiosity, and that can be problematic.
Yeah, I suppose I suppose my better question would be creating an environment for
Mhm.
flourish, as in for curiosity to flourish, which I guess that's the allowing people to question, contribute, challenge, almost that we go back to psychological safety, don't we, in that sense? And I always say to leaders, to create environments or to change cultures is predominantly driven by behaviors, which is predominantly driven by the leader and a role modeling piece in terms of how you shape, because people very, whether consciously or unconsciously, observe the leader and how they operate and whether they're taking risks and whether they're allowing people to contribute or challenge them, aren't they?
That's true. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the norms that people set between each other. Is this an environment for exploration and co creation, or is it one of competition? And of course, we would go about discovering that competition sometimes can be very helpful, but it's those patterns of engagement between different people that are being nurtured and sustained, heroed or otherwise, that determine access to curiosity and success by proxy.
So, just looking at your experience of working with special forces operators, and I'd just like to get your, I suppose, your perspective on what have you seen as their common traits of why they are special forces, why are they the elite, and what are some of those traits that can be then mirrored or replicated within the context of business that could be helpful?
don't please judge me for hearing up curiosity again. But when I started reviewing, uh, consciously focusing on what it is that the SAS soldier needs to have in order for them to succeed, it was many years into my service with the team. Prior to that, my job was to evaluate and assess fit for the team, obviously kind of filter out a variety of different risks. But I began to wonder whether curiosity is as important as it seems after my incident in Syria. And I went back to the team then. What was perhaps not so surprising is that things like physical fitness, the usual stuff you'd imagine may be required for someone to endure significant challenges, isn't as important as capacity for curiosity. The starting point of that is the individual's self awareness. How well do they understand themselves and what might trigger them in different situations? How confident and capable are they at being able to manage their own responses in a way that is constructive and that sustains the self efficacy? Also, deep sense of belonging in each and every one of them, not necessarily to the team, but to their own value system, a value system that has been tested, that they see as enabling the source of strength for themselves. Of course, then curiosity, and finally, the ability to maintain subjective equilibrium. And I say that deliberately because, the ability to maintain an even keel across different situations and to know how to access what they need most when they're being tested is essential. So to me, if we were to translate that to other environments, the starting point has to be self-awareness. And we know this to be true in leadership context, particularly for leaders who have significant influence on other people's lives and significant outcomes. The ability for them to understand which one of their responses and interpretations of different situations is enabling or disabling, and how quick they are to navigate that is essential. But also the ability to sustain commitment to the things that define them, the values that they espouse, and that consistency over time that in turn builds and sustains trust with others.
And just picking up on that subjective equilibrium, I almost like to explore a bit more with that, and how do you maintain such subjective equilibrium in a variety of situations. Appreciate SAS are in very extreme situations, which we can get some learnings from that in terms of how we can relate that into the context of business. But then again, extremes with SAS can still be extreme relatively to somebody in a business world, can't they?
Absolutely. I genuinely believe that, and this is not necessarily just my belief, but we have to accept every one of these individuals is trained for the subjective, extreme. They are trained to deal with it. And one humbling component that I learned over time with them is in situations such as the extremes in a military context, you are allowed a few more reactions, but you're not necessarily allowed that when you're dealing with a subordinate that doesn't appear to hear you well, or so what I'm saying is that in the civilian space, we have to control ourselves a whole lot better, but we don't necessarily regulate better. We don't necessarily learn how to do that as effectively. Coming back to the subjective equilibrium part, these words verbatim were the words of a dear friend of ours, Leon, who unfortunately lost his life in service some years back on an operational deployment. An exceptional man who coined that phrase when we were trying to identify the ways in which each of the individuals on this operational deployment were maintaining connection with what matters most to them. So an example of that was Leon, who very much wanted to become a skipper on a boat. So he spent his time having this little diary, little notebook in the middle of Afghanistan, trying to visualize what things would feel like, sound like, smell like when he's on his favorite boat as a skipper, right? His mind was in this place of trying to manage some of the negative experiences in the moment that he couldn't control, and he was consciously controlling where his attention would go whenever he had the time to do so. One of the most challenging things that happens in military context is that thing called hurry up and wait. You could prepare for a very dynamic, very complicated mission, but then the mission might be delayed and you are on standby for days, weeks, months sometimes, right? So, how you maintain your equilibrium, your own balance, your own sense of sanity, your own sense of alignment with your own view of life in situations like that can sway from the extreme to the dull is incredibly important. So, knowing what matters most to you, knowing what you're moving towards, and most importantly, the basics that so many of us disregard: physical health, training regime, and it can be the kind of training regime in the context that they can carry out without any equipment in a 2x2 box, because of course you have to be able to be agile and mobile with that stuff. But I've observed that they don't compromise on those basics. They know how to deeply respect sleep and nutrition because they don't always have good access to it. And so the things that we sacrifice so lightly in our civilian space just no go zone in those environments. And I love that as a lessons learned because they prepare and they are in a state of readiness for the acute. And every one of us is, you know, um, expected to wrestle with some version of acute, but we are a great deal more negligent with those basics that we
Mm.
require.
That's really interesting. I remember I read something a while back where if you're feeling a bit flat or not feeling full of energy, first of all, think about, have you drank enough water? Have you slept
Yeah.
enough? And have you eaten? And I think
Yeah.
in civilian life, we forget of those core things that we need, basic essentials, which obviously in the military is fundamental for survival.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to that. And it goes back to that whole, which is probably what military mindset and training does, is daily habits, isn't it? Habits that will help you build. I talk a lot about building almost a resilient framework. I mean, I do habits of cold water immersion. I do gratitude,
Yes.
mindfulness. I do these various habits that help me in a stressful situation, or help me be more mindful, helping me more present and things like that, and be more logical thinking and thinking of clarity of thought. What
Mhm.
habits have you noticed within the military or in yourself that have been helpful to build that sort of resilient nature?
I think outside of the subjective ones that different individuals interpret for themselves and align with differently, one that I've seen uncompromised is breathing, the power of breath. Weirdly enough, when we're thinking about the last 15 years or so, perhaps out here in Australasia, we've seen a surge of focus on breath work, right? But what I've really loved about the power of it is the humbling realization that, for example, snipers or SA soldiers wouldn't necessarily step into any task unless they regulate their breath first. It's a very practical thing, right? If you're not breathing effectively, you know the consequences on your thinking, on the blood effectively distributing across the muscles you need to execute a task effectively. So it's confronting and grounding to watch how before they enter a task, they focus on the good old box breathing, like 4 breaths in, hold your breath, 4 breaths out, hold your breath. And again, when you see individuals and teams like these that are so practical about the things that they invest the time in, focusing on something some of us roll our eyes at and think it's so woke. It's sort of, so this is one example that I could hero up as being essential and that I see being practiced, no matter who is, in a driver's seat of that experience.
Yeah, it's interesting, that whole breathing piece. I do a lot of breathing with
Mhm.
the cold water piece, but actually, all these things we talked about have become part of the sort of the wellness sort of strategies of organisations. But actually,
Right.
it's been within the military for years. It's just not been shared in that sense, and that's built them who they are, isn't it?
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the common sense nature of these things that is astonishing, right? I think many of us expect to be convinced and expect to see like a really complex thesis behind it as to why we should be doing it. But I just really love the common sense um, nature of these habits and practices that those who are prepared on a daily to confront the unpredictable do. So I think more of us should just not question it and go on and do it, you know?
And just one, I suppose, last question. As much as in the military, they train, they do scenario planning, and they do all these sort of techniques, which obviously there's lots of learning in that for an organization as well. What sort of final thoughts would you say that would help teams, organizations, help them build more resilience within their sort of their people, really, based on your experience?
Again, I cannot start without double clicking on curiosity. Let's start thinking consciously about how we obstruct it. The environment in which we are going to continue to operate is unlikely to become any simpler, any more manageable than it has already been. We know that we do have significant trials ahead of us, and curiosity is absolutely essential for us to think outside of what is familiar. And so when I think about what are the things that matter most, it is ensuring that we have consistent clarity of purpose, that we maintain our commitment to that, and we inform beautiful thinking, healthy human minds around us that are part of this organizational fabric of any significant changes in due course. Now, there's so much confusion and loss of potential I've observed over the last, well, however many years I've been in the industry, because we mask or pivot or kind of change tech without informing people. Doubt, skepticism, again, a kind of limited fixed solutions and normal response to these kinds of moments in time. So clarity of purpose. And the second part, which is my favorite, is shared frame of reference, ensuring that we understand how it is that we are going to support one another, how we are going to nurture that shared culture that holds us together, and respect our potential for everyone to contribute to it meaningfully and authentically, are just non-negotiables if we are to move forward better.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, having that shared sort of support and community. I think that's really important. I think we all need people around us to support each other, to keep us going. Because sometimes, as there was three of you in that hostage situation, some at moments one of you is higher than the other and all that sort of stuff, and one cracked a joke to keep things going. We all need other people to help us navigate these difficulties that we're going to face, and the fact of life is we're all going to face them at some point. I really appreciate you coming on the show, Olivia, and thank you for your insights. How can people get in touch with you and connect with you?
I think LinkedIn would be great. Let's continue on some rich conversations via this platform.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time today.